Well, I hope you're ready for an experiment tonight. This is, I've been working on this topic off and on, and figured it was time to try to get it together. I know a lot about it, says he immodestly, but whether I can project it and do it in a time that even with padded chairs will work for you, and we shall see. How many of you remember the film The Sting? Do you remember they'd turn a chapter and it would say whatever it was? Well, I thought about it. I've got about 4 articles on the computer, which I'm not very good with, and I call this segment The Fight. Now, I had asked David Clark, the librarian, sent him over and asked him to do some illustrations for you. But Ilsley Library doesn't have the books that the illustrations have been published, so you're going to just have me. For that, I apologize. Now, this I've actually got committed to prose, and I'm going to sort of read and talk, but it won't be that long. But in March of 1780, Matthew Lyon, the hot-tempered colleague and intimate of Ethan and Ira Allen, Governor Thomas Chittenden, and the faction that dominated early Vermont political life, came to blows with Nathaniel Chipman. Ambitious, Yale-educated, legally trained, a strict Congregationalist, Chipman's background contrasted very sharply with Lyon, the ultra-sensitive Irishman, former indentured servant, religious dissenter, aggressive entrepreneur, staunch Democrat with a hair-trigger temper. Like good Irishmen, he could hold a grudge. Nearly 2 decades later, Lyon would attack a fellow congressman on the floor of the House of Representatives. And he'd also win re-election to Congress while he languished in the Virgins jail for violating the Sedition Act. Brought to Westminster in 1780 for a legislative session, they encountered each other in the law office of Stephen Roe Bradley in what Chipman later labeled as a ludicrous transaction. How many of you have ever heard of Stephen Roe Bradley? It's amazing. That's a topic for another thing, but if you get the current issue of Livin' magazine, you'll discover a piece on Stephen Roe Bradley, who, among other things, designed the American flag. Was the first senator from Vermont, was a president pro tem of the U.S. Senate through the Jefferson 2 administrations, invented the caucus to nominate candidates for the presidency, wrote the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A Vermonter, really distinguished, nobody's heard of him. But we have a train called Ethan Allen and a bowling alley in Burlington and a laundry, but what the heck. Chipman, who had served for a year in the Continental Army, resigned his commission at Valley Forge for want of funds, studied law with Tapping Reeve, migrated in April 1779 to Teignmouth, where his father had fled from Connecticut, where the war had, quote, driven, close quotes, his parents, this is Chipman's, from their habitation plundered and for the present reduced to poverty. He pompously regarded himself, and this is directly from Chipman, it's not me, as a rara avis enteris, who would become, quote, the oracle of law in the state of Vermont. Ha, 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 the young patrician sneered to a friend, I cannot but laugh when I think what a flash we shall make when we come to be members of Congress. He deemed the many steps we must mount to that pinnacle of happiness vexing. Let's see, he waxed on. First an attorney, then a selectman, then a huffing justice, a deputy, an assistant, and finally a member of Congress. Sort of interesting. And that was referring to the Continental Congress. There was no U.S. Congress under the Constitution then. The Vermont House of Representatives, he inaccurately called the Assembly, requested Chipman prepare a report on betterments, a task he found vexing. lower rung on his ladder to success. Lyon, one of the two members of the Vermont Assembly from Arlington, viscerally loathed those he regarded as aristocrats in any form of hereditary establishment. In the Westminster session, the legislature in those days was peripatetic. The first session in Montpelier was in October 1809. Up to that point, it went from one town to another, including having met in Charleston, New Hampshire, which it regarded as Vermont at the moment. He had forced a roll call on a portion of a bill authorizing taxes to assist local institutions. Incidentally, that bill did pass, and that'll come back to us later. The bill exempted collecting taxes for the support of worship for the minister of the gospel, or to build or repair a meeting house if it ran contrary to the dictates of individual's conscience, provided said person or persons shall support some form of religious worship. As a dissenter, Lyon unsuccessfully tried to strike that qualifier. He also bitterly opposed Chipman's report to the Assembly on betterments. You'll find out what a betterment is in a minute. It's not a mint or a buttermint, it's a betterment. On the value of improvements made on confiscated property. Vermont financed its early years and its Revolutionary War effort through the confiscation and sale of Loyalist property. Lyon, Chittenden, and their Allen allies actively participated in that scheme as commissioners of sequestration, serving on courts of sequestration and purchasing confiscated property. Lyon bought several Loyalist properties, including the Arlington farm of Dr. Samuel Adams, whom Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys with whom they had loudly clashed before the war. Adams, who held a New Hampshire title, had changed sides and began noisily espousing New York claims. This is before Vermont asserted its independence in 1777. When asked to, quote, change his conversation on the subject, or at least to be silent, Adams persisted and armed himself with a pair of good pistols and other private weapons. The Green Mountain Boys captured him by surprise, carted him off to Bennington, where the Kangaroo Court ordered him tied to an armchair and hoisted up the signpost of Landlord Fay's Green Mountain Tavern. You've probably all seen that Dr. Adams sitting in a chair about 25 feet above the ground. Here he dangled in front of a, quote, a catamount skin stuffed sitting upon a signpost 25 feet from the ground with large teeth looking and grinning toward New York. I think the teeth of the catamount, not Adams, but you know, a good 18th century writer, you got to allow a dangling phrase or two. Ira Allen recalled, quote, this mild and exemplary disgrace had a salutary effect on the doctor and many others. An effort given added weight by another Yorker that he overheard Ethan Allen saying that he'd rather administered 500 lashes. The Redemption Act of 1780 allowed Tories, some of whom had only committed the offense of opposing Vermont and supporting New York, to return to their confiscated property. That is, they could go and come back on it, but they had to buy it. A dispute ensued over whether the claimants, that is, in this case, Dr. Adams, had to pay for the improvements made to his property when he didn't have it. Those are betterments. Lyon alleged that the Adams farm, and I'm quoting Lyon, was in miserable condition when he took it over. I cleared, he asserted, considerable on the farm and have at this time 11 acres of wheat on it, which was a piece of choice mowing and was exceedingly heavy, bad clearing. Lyon was not, didn't write with facility. But nevertheless, you get the point. He'd cleared land, had a crop on it, and along comes Adams demanding his land back under the Redemption Act of 1780. Lyon resisted turning over the farm until Adams paid for the clearing, fencing, etc., and other improvements, and he fiercely clung to that position. Lyon took offense at Chipman's legal interpretation that the law did not specifically provide for payment for improvement, and claimants would not have to pay for them. Chipman took the position, these were illegally confiscated lands. The person that bought them at the confiscation court didn't own them and therefore did not have to, would not be entitled to receive compensation for the betterments. You can imagine Lyon was pretty damn unhappy. Lyon, in a very rude and pointed manner, he walked into Stephen R. Bradley's law office in Westminster. Bradley was the first lawyer recognized by Vermont courts. He walked into the office and there was Chipman sitting there with a penknife sharpening his quill. And Lyon, and this is, most of what I'm reading to you is quoted material from contemporary documents, in a rude and very pointed manner leveled an insulting charge that no man with a spark of honesty could write such a report. Chipman replied in an ad hominem retort, delivered, as he said, in passion, contemptuously branding Lyon an ignorant Irish puppy. Now you can imagine that set him off. The former indentured servant who had immigrated from Ireland in 1759 at the age of 13 flew at Chipman. Grabbing his hair, breaking his stylish comb, Chipman defended himself, stabbing at his assailant with a knife that he'd been using to mend his quill. When Bradley seized Lyon from behind around the arms, Lyon threw his feet out across the table, tried to kick Chipman. The awkward appearance of and they finally got him, one by the shoulders and one by the feet, and they dumped him in the corner, where Chipman, with haughty disdain, recalled that it provoked me to laugh. I'm sure that did a lot good for Matthew Lyon, too. Lyon would never forget, and they held a grudge for many years. Now, I just start off to try to make my point that a lot of this early politics is pretty rock and roll and rough and tumble, and it's highly personal. I don't think you call people an ignorant Irish puppy these days. You know. In any case, that's the fight. The general theory, if you were to read, say, Freedom and Unity, the relatively new one-volume history of the state, which is a fine piece of work, or some of the other more recent works that touch this period, is that between 1777, when Vermont declared its independence, and 1791, when it became the fourth state, that there were very large and important structural changes. Population. It was roughly, it's an estimate, 14,000 people lived in Vermont when it declared its independence in 1777. The U.S. Census Bureau estimates the population of Vermont at about 40,000 in 1780. Ira Allen, in his history, estimates, and he wrote in the published in 1798, estimates 30,000. And we do have a count in the census of 1791 of 85,245 folks. That's an incredible growth rate. It's a growth rate of approximately 12.8% per year, and of that 12.8%, 2.2% was natural increase. The rest was immigration into the state. That's important because the type of immigration, presumably, changed the face of Vermont. The folks coming tended to be young. Virtually all of them, if you don't count Peacham where they came from Scotland, but almost all of them came from other places in what had become the United States. Therefore, they came from states where they were accustomed to a state and a state government and a state constitution, and where they hadn't had a fight since inception with New York. So they didn't come with that anti-New York sense that the folks who started the state in 1777 had and held. Many had seen service in the Continental Army. And so they had a sense of nationalism that was not shared by many in Vermont. Although Seth Warner's regiment was a Continental regiment, the Vermonters, by and large, fought as Vermont militia companies. And, to some extent, a couple times they lined up against New York over in the Willamette Valley. So there wasn't the same sense of national identity here in Vermont that these folks brought to the state. Many were well educated. They came as lawyers and ministers and doctors. Not all, of course, not even a high percentage. But if you compare that to the percentage of those who came by 1777, there wasn't a lawyer in the state. And there were very few with an education beyond secondary, even into secondary. Some had aspired, like Ethan Allen, who had begun to prep to go to Yale when his father died, and that ended that. So they were different breed of cats. The old guard, and they are referred to as the old guard in some of the language of the day and the literature of the day, unlike the new ones, tended to be less churched. Now there were, among the original folks who came and were part of the independence movement in Vermont, people who were very churched, particularly the Bennington crowd that all came from mostly Hardwick, Mass, and formed that New Light under the Reverend Jedediah Dewey Church, and they also actually spread out into Shaftesbury and Arlington by religion. Arlington got the Anglicans, Bennington got the Congregationalists. So it wasn't as if they were totally unchurched, but compared, the Allens were not exactly church people. Although Ethan came from an Episcopal background and was involved in some interesting correspondence in his hometown in Connecticut in the early 1760s. But there's no evidence that I could see of the Allens really attending church and being deacons. Some of the Vermont revolutionaries were, but by comparison with the folks who were coming to the state, they were different. The old guard, as I mentioned to you, had a long history with fighting Yorkers. They were populists, tended to be frontier radicals. Folks who came were more conservative in their view and in their politics. The folks who were part of the old guard were often large landholders and speculators. Those who came were holding less land and working the land they did. All of these things are generalizations. I could give you 14 examples on each side where my generalization doesn't hold. But as you're painting a large canvas, you're going to get that the first Wednesday in June, power through art. Well, you paint this canvas, and I think I'm all right. They were part of the Green Mountain Boys, and oh, did they have family ties. I hope I can do this without boring you, but I've gone through and followed some of these people. Samuel Safford, who was on the first Council of Safety and continued to be on the Council of Safety, married Joseph Fay's grandson. His daughter, second daughter, married Joseph Fay's grandson. His brothers married into the Robinson, Fassett, and Walbridge clan, all original parts of the Hardwick group that migrated to Bennington. Jonas Fay married John Fassett Jr. John Fassett Jr. and John Fassett Sr. were part of the old guard. During the French and Indian War, they served in Samuel Robinson's Bennington company. Jonas Fay's twin sons married Ethan Allen and Heman Allen. I knew they didn't marry Ethan. They were named. He named his kids, Ethan and Heman Allen. Timothy Bronson, who was cousin to Ethan Allen's first wife, Mary Bronson, was a leader of the old guard. Samuel Robinson Jr. second wife, Esther, was a daughter of Joseph Safford. Another one. Moses Robinson, really important person. The only person to ever get elected governor during the years that Chittenden was serving. And the first, one of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, one of the first 2 U.S. senators, worked with the Green Mountain Boys, led a militia regiment, and eventually became part of the group that rebelled against the old guard. First wife was Mary Fay, daughter of landlord Stephen Fay, Catamount Tavern. His brother David Robinson married Sarah Fay, Stephen Fay's daughter. Jonathan, the youngest son, had a son named Isaac Tickner Robinson, Tickner Bennington of the new group. Robinson and others, you get the point. I don't need to overdo that for you, which I've already done. So, the early Vermont government, if you think of Vermont, it had factions. And I need to describe those a little bit so you can sort of set people where they were. Are you with me so far? This is actually holding some logic? Good. You had the Green Mountain Boys, the radicals, the ones who started the conventions at Dorset and then took them across the state to Westminster and Windsor, and eventually wrote and promulgated the Constitution, named the state Vermont. They were largely West Side people. The Allens were big in it. Timothy Bronson, Safford, Fassett, the names that I've been talking about, Robinson. They were one group. They were clearly not a majority. Another group, and a powerful group, had lived on both sides of the Connecticut River. The leader on the Vermont side was Jacob Bailey, who became a general during the war. Jacob Bailey and Moses Hazen, after the French and Indian War, instead of coming south on Lake Champlain to the road, the Crown Point Road, and going back to their northern Massachusetts and New Hampshire towns, cut diagonally from St. John on the Richelieu River and over essentially through the tip of Lake Memphremagog and hit the Coos Oxbow on the Connecticut, where Newbury and Bradford, Vermont are, and across the river is it Pierpont and I know, but I'm not getting Haverhill, New Hampshire. Those were their hometowns. And they went to Bennington Wentworth and got him to Grant Towns, and they named him that, and they came and settled there. And when the New York Vermont controversy, or New York-New Hampshire grants controversy really got going hard, they had enough cash that they could take advantage of the New York offer to have their titles transferred to New York titles by paying so much per acre. And Bailey had a heck of a lot of land, and Vermont independence threatened his New York holdings. And so he was not pleased at all with that situation. In fact, somewhere here I quoted, he called the Allens all the dogs of hell combined. I won't dig that out for you right now, but it's pretty colorful language. He linked up with the leadership at Dartmouth College, Eleazar Wheelock, his son-in-law, Basil Woodward, and the New Hampshire folks along the Connecticut River, the towns along the river and maybe a tier or two in, I really had some problems with New Hampshire's new government that had taken over from the colonial New Hampshire government. They were on the frontier. They didn't feel that they were getting proper defense against the British threats and the Indian threats. They didn't feel that they were getting appointments to militia officerships and justice of the peace and those kinds of things. They didn't feel that they were getting the kind of internal improvements, attention to roads that they should have. They didn't think that they were getting adequate representation in the New Hampshire legislature, which was then meeting in Exeter. They were unhappy with New Hampshire, and Bailey and the Dartmouth folks got together and decided that they would join and either have a separate state or join Vermont. And they did join Vermont in the East Union, the first one in 1779. When they came into Vermont, of course, they overwhelmed the Vermont legislature now with New Hampshire votes, and that East Side group had a clear majority in the legislature, really threatening the West Siders, led by Chittenden, Allen, Lyon, Fassett, Safford, so forth. South of them, in the Connecticut River Valley, Guilford, the southeastern corner of the state, Vernon just north of it, Dummerston, Brattleboro, they were Yorkers. Most of them had either converted their titles to New York or had gotten some New York titles and wanted New York government. In fact, New York had appointed justice of the peace, court officers. They were sending representatives to the New York Assembly. And New York had appointed some of them New York militia officers. They did not want Vermont. They were pretty much in rebellion against Vermont until about 1782, so that's 5 years. In 1779, under Vermont law, a Vermont militia captain went in and started to pick out folks from Guilford who should serve in his militia company, and they refused, and so he did what the law allowed. He went in and confiscated a couple of cows, and the Yorker adherents rescued the cows. The cows would have been sold at auction and the money used for the militia. And Ethan Allen had to get in front of a group of people and go over there and put down the Great Cow War, where he arrested 40-some Yorkers and had them thrown in jail in Westminster. And the Vermont court organized, and Ethan, in full uniform, bombasted around. The Vermont court recognized Stephen Roe Bradley, as the first time as an attorney. He defended them, and he defended them so well, Allen really got angry and with his sword in court, threatened everybody. The artful and dodging, pettifogging lawyer. Bradley ended up being Allen's lawyer. He also ended up, when Allen went in 1784 to Bradley's house in Westminster, this is an aside, to get some legal work done on some land sales he was trying to do, he met Fanny Montessor, an attractive widow, and in a whirlwind romance of less than a week, they were married. He moved her back to Arlington, where they were living, and then had his brother build him the house in Burlington at the Intervale, where they came to live in 1787. So, Bradley, pretty interesting guy, but none of you have ever heard of him. You've got some good stuff in front of you. So the East Union, they were part of that. It was this New York group in the southwest east corner of the state. The Allen Chittenden faction, I've talked about some. And then there were groups that were pro-Vermont generally, but more conservative. These are, the Green Mountain Boys, when they were tearing things up and their guerrilla tactics and preventing justices of the peace from working, and preventing courts from working, that's not a good polity in which to live. I mean, you want to get married, that wasn't a church thing, it was a civil contract. How do you do it without a justice of the peace or a court? You want to enforce a debt or a land claim or a boundary line, how do you do it if there's no courts? And so as Vermont moved toward independence, and as the United States declared its independence, the Green Mountain Boys were gradually losing their popularity in the state because people wanted some sense of stability. Does that make sense to you? So you have these factions. And how do they play out in early Vermont? Well, the form of the government becomes important. The first Constitution sets up an assembly. It was called the General Assembly. And there's one representative from each town, unless the town had 80 or more eligible voters, that is, males of age. And at that point, they got 2 representatives. There was a council of 12 members, elected at large, sort of like the Chittenden County senatorial delegation. 6 senators all elected at large. It is the single most least representative legislative district in the United States, is Chittenden County Senate. But nobody pays attention to that. You know, you could live in Westford and Essex and Underhill and be a Republican, but you could never elect one. That's sort of how the council worked. It was at large around the state, across the state. And I've gone through and listed the members of the council year by year by year. Membership doesn't change. Safford, you've heard me say his name, he was on the council 27 years. The first council had Thomas Chittenden, he was governor. Joseph Marsh was lieutenant governor. East, West, Chittenden West, Arlington, Williston, Marsh, Woodstock. Ira Allen, Jacob Bailey, Joseph Bowker, Timothy Brownson, Benjamin Carpenter, Jeremiah Clark, Emmons, Fay, Peter Alcott, Paul Spooner, Moses Robinson. What, you know, how many of those names did you hear me before? Robinson, Fay, Clark, Carpenter, Brownson, Boker, Allen. That's all part of that coterie. And Matthew Lyon is the clerk, or the secretary. So you had a council elected at large. There was no Senate. The council served as the executive officers, although the state also elected at large a governor, lieutenant governor, treasurer, surveyor general, and a couple of other offices. But the council served sort of as a governor's council, a cabinet, and really made the executive decisions. And you had the legislature appointed the courts. The judges elected the members of the judges. There was nobody with legal training in the first few Supreme Courts of Vermont, or it was called the Superior Court, because lawyer and Yorker kind of meant the same thing. So that the government was really set up, and the council met in Thomas Chittenden's kitchen in Arlington. Chittenden lived in Hawley's house that had been confiscated from him, and Chittenden had bought through a court. And the East Side members, Bailey and others, really had trouble getting to those meetings. So there was a small coterie of folks that was essentially running the state, and the council acted as an upper house. They had to review legislation, and they had a veto on legislation. So you've got a small group of people that were generally called the Arlington Junto or the Allen Chittenden faction that could pretty well dominate public policy in the state. How did they finance this state? Land, land, and land. It's sort of like a restaurant, isn't it? Location, location, location. Right away, to avoid any taxes, that was the confiscation and sequestration of Loyalist property, or Yorker property sometimes, who weren't too loyal, or weren't loyalists to the crown. In 1780, in defiance of Congress, Continental Congress, Vermont began to make its own land grants. And they made a lot of them. 180 towns were granted, or patents, charters made. That's the wrong number. That's too high. But it was a lot. And you find that when they dissolved the Second East Union, for example, the legislature, the assembly immediately issued a charter or a patent to 590 owners of the towns of the two heroes, which are now South Hero, Grand Isle, and North Hero, Vermont. They were then called the two heroes. All 40 of the members of the assembly that voted to dissolve the Union, which is what the Allens wanted to get done, were new landowners after that bill. They tended to use the grants both for themselves, but when you granted land, the people didn't just get it and say thank you, they had to pay for it. And that's how they were financing the state. And they were also granting land to folks that they wanted to have wedded to Vermont titles, which meant wedded to Vermont maintaining independence. So it was both the currency of the realm and it was a powerful political tool. And they used it with impunity. The unions. I told you about the college party, Bailey and the Dartmouth people, bringing 16 towns into Vermont. The Continental Congress in Washington more or less promised that they would recognize Vermont as a state if they got rid of that. And the Allens managed to do that through some very slippery work in the Vermont Assembly and through the two heroes grant. I guess you could call that close to bribery. They, as a way to fight back against Congress, 2 years later in 1781, the Allen faction went back to the east side and tried to annex them. And they went over to New York and annexed 12 towns there. And so at one point, Greater Vermont was quite a bit larger. They were essentially trying to use this as a way to threaten New Hampshire, New York, and try to force congressional recognition of Vermont as a state. It didn't work, and eventually, the Vermont militia was lined up against the New York militia on the Walloomsoc at one point, and New Hampshire was not. You shouldn't have me on tape, Chris. I was about to say New Hampshire for Damshire was not happy. So those things are going on. Vermont also gets into the Haldimand negotiations. Another way, and historians have argued about this, another way to try to force congressional recognition was to treat with the British. And they did. And one thinks that had Yorktown not occurred, the news of it got here in October of 1781, they might have brought a Haldimand, governor of Canada, proclamation into the Vermont Assembly, attempting to take Vermont back into the British Empire. I, for one, believe that these were real negotiations. Other historians will argue they were just trying to use them as a hammer. As this is going on, remember I was telling you people were coming into the state? And these people coming into the state were talented and didn't share the agenda of the Allen-Chittenden group, and things were beginning to change. And we're through this, don't worry about it. Michael Belle-Isle writes, "It's not easy to pin down the factions because their personal networks superseded political opinions." And I think that that's correct. There were two Vermont newspapers in the 1780s, one out of Windsor and one out of Bennington. They were weeklies. They often published the same things, one a week after the other. But Stephen R. Bradley's nickname in the papers was the Pastime. Roger Enos was called the Pretty Town Horse, or Old Roger. Nathaniel Niles, one of the reformers or the conservative group, educated at both Harvard and Yale, had studied medicine, was a minister, came and settled in Fairleigh. He was called Connecticut Blue. Isaac Tickner, Princeton graduate, came to Bennington as a commissary for this Continental Army, a lawyer, became governor of the state for about 6 terms. His name was Jersey Slick. Samuel Hickok, a militia leader, was known, he was called Northern Ranger. Elijah Payne, he was a New Hampshire guy, was called Peacock. Jonathan Arnold, another one, was called the Narragansett Pacer. That was a kind of a horse. Moses Robinson from Bennington, the Old Script. And Matthew Lyon was called the Bold Sweeper. So it was personal. You know what Chittenden's nickname was? Old One Eye. He was blind in one eye. Let's see. Every now and then, the venom and the vitriol in the newspaper would get to somebody to the point where they would write a letter complaining about it. And here's the Vermont Gazette of June 5, 1786. Jonathan Langdon of Bennington is upset about the ignorant and unwarranted blackguarding, nonsense, and aspersions cast on private characters. Have we no men of abilities that your paper are filled with such stuff as disgrace the state? And the authors, ? Did they not coward-like write under fictitious signatures? They all had an acronym, of some sort. I am of the opinion with Mr. Spooner that if the authors were obliged to appear with their performances, knaves would be silent and fools ashamed. It was not pleasant stuff. Another one, the Vermont Gazette, 9 October 1786. These papers are fun to read, incidentally. The editors of the paper piously declare, "We have studiously avoided making ourselves partisan in any manner." And at no time do they refuse pieces sent to them. They have suffered especially by the last struggle and so forth. So the newspapers, and that's a preface because I'm going to read from a few of them as we go. The rival leaders to the old guard that I described, Tickner, told you, Princeton, lawyer, Continental Army officer, commissary, settled in Bennington. Bradley, lawyer, Yale University, Continental Army officer also in Connecticut. Chipman, I read some of his stuff, the ambitious little Popinjay. Micah Townsend, Princeton trained. Nathaniel Niles, I mentioned him from Fairleigh. Samuel Knight, Israel Smith, both legally trained. Increase Mosley, who had been in the Connecticut courts for 30 years before he migrated. These were the new men of Vermont, and they had a reform agenda. And the reform agenda was to weaken the council, was to end multiple office holding. Ira Allen at one point held the office of Surveyor General, Treasurer, member of the council, and Vermont's representative to the Continental Congress. One of Vermont's representatives. They wanted to codify the laws. When the first Vermont legislature got together, they had no legislative library. They had no laws. And they had nobody with experience writing laws. These folks wanted to get a legal code and get it codified. These are not necessarily, bad things. The issues. How did this get fought out? And I know I'm getting close to 8 o'clock, so I can't keep you here forever. After the Revolution, when people came, this mass of people coming to Vermont, the ones that didn't come with a profession and with private money had to borrow. They usually borrowed to buy their land. They usually had to have some sort of stake for shelter. You didn't get a crop in the first year. Had to have some sort of stake for tools and seed. Maybe you could bring that with you. They had to have some sort of stake for clothing. They had to have some sort of stake for the kinds of food goods that they couldn't grow, in particular salt and rum, but salt for curing was extremely important. Almost all of the Vermont settlers had a debt. After the Revolution, this country went into a fairly substantial economic recession or depression. this hard money specie, gold, silver, copper, was extremely hard to find in the country and almost impossible in Vermont. Chittenden recognized this, and now with lawyers and courts, there was a lot of litigation from the creditors to the debtors. Debtors had no way to pay it, and there was the threat and jailing. Chittenden, the governor, and his group were much more men of the people, and I told you before they were populists. And so he proposed a General Tender Act. That is, you could pay your debts with wheat or cattle or wood or potash or pearl ash or anything that you had that could establish a market price. He also proposed a bank, and he also proposed a tax on legal suits, which got the reformers, the lawyer group, pretty unhappy. They were also very much opposed to the General Tender Act. They were hard money people, and they were opposed to a bank, which they thought would produce nothing but inflation. I guess maybe today you could have some sympathy with opposition to banks, but Chittenden proposed that. They fought him in the assembly. They knew that he had a majority, so they managed to put it off and go to a referendum after the legislative session. And they managed to beat it in the referendum. So it was a fight over that. You can see sort of a philosophical difference there. There were fights over taxes. In the situation after the general tender and the bank did not pass, Vermont experienced riots in both Windsor and Rutland, very serious ones in Rutland. And the militia, the debtors, the militia had to come out and put that down and jail some people. Just about the time that happens, things break loose in Massachusetts with Shays' Rebellion. Same sort of debtor-creditor controversy. Only the Shays folks got in the armory and armed themselves, and they fought. They were beaten back rather quickly and handily by the Massachusetts militia, and many of them came into Vermont. Chittenden was forced to issue a proclamation saying that they were not welcome in Vermont, although Willard Stern Randall, you may know him, the Champlain College historian and the biographer a good biographer, told me not long ago that he has the names of many of the Shayites from the Massachusetts court records, and he's been able to locate them in Vermont census records. So apparently Chittenden issued his proclamation, but there wasn't a great deal of enforcement. But it scared people. And it allowed Chittenden to be able to get a tender act through the legislature, but it defined what the tender would be, that it couldn't be anything. There were certain products, and those were largely marketable products. But there was a real fight over this. The legislature, the Constitution of Vermont set up something called a Council of Censors. Every 7 years, the public was supposed to elect 13 people to sit down and review the Constitution and review what the Vermont government had done under that Constitution and see what was illegal, what was legal, and make recommendations to change the Constitution. The ones elected to that clearly were anti-Chittenden. And they not only went through and decided some 40 actions were against the law or against the Constitution, but they rewrote the Constitution and called a constitutional convention for 1786. And that constitutional convention ended multiple office holding, the new Constitution. It attempted to define representation in the Assembly by limiting the Assembly to 50 members and then parceling them out with districts. They didn't make it. There were too many new frontier towns with very little population who wanted a seat in the legislature. And so it was one legislator, one town. That old 2 legislators, if you have 80 or more, and it was gone. And that persisted until 1966 when Vermont had to change its legislature after the United States Supreme Court ruling. It's interesting. So there's a victory on the Chittenden side there on that one. They attempted to reduce the power of the council, and they did that by removing some of the veto power and saying the council had to respond to legislation within 3 days, or the assembly had control of that. They got that through. There was a substantial reform, and that substantial reform was fought out in the newspapers. I mean, the battles in the newspapers are not pleasant to read, but colorful. And it was and it was name calling, Jersey Slick and the old one-eyed, you know, and but it gave the reformers, as they like to refer to themselves. Does it seem strange to you that reformers were the real conservatives? Things have changed. It gave the reformers some control, and they immediately banged through about 40 laws covering crime, murder, sodomy, marriage, homosexuality, all kinds of things, and putting the death penalty on quite a few of them. The major issue that turned the tables in Vermont politics then came in 1787-88. It's called the Woodbridge Affair. It's a very hard thing to sort out, but I think I've sorted it. This is the one that flips things so that Vermont enters the Union. But I'll show you how dirty it is. In 1781, the Assembly made a grant of a township called Woodbridge to Major Theodore Woodbridge. Woodbridge is essentially the same as what the town of Troy is now, up on the Canadian border. J. Peak in Troy? Thank you. Woodbridge and his associates did not pay the fees, and the charter was revoked. In 1783, the Assembly authorized the payment of the Surveyor General, Ira Allen, for his expenses for surveying. And they authorized Ira Allen to dispose of the town of Woodbridge and 35 rights in the town of Jay. Allen didn't do it. Instead, he supported his expenses himself. He paid his own expenses. In 1785, the governor and council authorized Allen's back payment for expenses by selling the town of Woodbridge and 35 rights in the town of Jay, which the Assembly had authorized in 83. The problem in 1785 was that meeting of the council did not have a quorum. There were only 6 there instead of 7. In 1786, Allen loses his election to remain Surveyor General, and he asked Chittenden, if now he wanted to be paid out, if he would deliver to him the rights to Woodbridge and those 35 rights in Jay. Chittenden did so. A year later, Jonathan Hunt, one of the Chipman-Tickner henchmen, asked, and a member of the council, asked the legislature to provide him a grant, and the description of the land he wanted granted was the description of Woodbridge. Allen argued against it, but the legislature, the Assembly, made the grant. A year later, when the Assembly met again, Hunt stood up and expressed his outrage that the council had given that land to Ira Allen and that it was illegal because they didn't have a quorum. And they stirred up one large scandal. As a result, in the elections in 1789, Thomas Chittenden did not receive a majority. He was very close. Moses Robinson had fewer than 25% of the vote. There were two other candidates. Without a majority, what happens in Vermont? Goes to the legislature. And the legislature, led by these rebels or the reformers, elected Moses Robinson governor. With Chittenden out of the way, Chipman, Tickner, Robinson immediately repaired by correspondence, being run by Daniel Chipman, Nathaniel Chipman's brother, to Alexander Hamilton and others in New York. New York had begun to thaw. Not Governor Clinton of New York, who, to the time he went to his grave, hated Vermont. And they essentially did the negotiations with New York that got the commissions, the Vermont Commission and the New York Commission, to meet and see if there couldn't be a way worked out, a rapprochement between Vermont and New York that would then allow Vermont to join the Union. Hamilton was interested in Vermont joining the Union, although he got out of it after he became Secretary of the Treasury in the Washington administration, but it was handled by other Yorkers, including John Jay. And they were interested, they understood that New York was never going to enforce their claims, and it was better to get what they could rather than just keep arguing. They also were concerned that Kentucky was applying for statehood, and they didn't want another slave state to outnumber the non-slave states, and Vermont would provide a balance to that. Those are the two major reasons. They were also concerned because Vermont was still negotiating with Canada and the British, mostly for trade, although in the 1790s Ira got himself arrested with 20,000 stand of French muskets headed for the United States, presumably to arm the French Canadians and do a little damage there. But that's the Olive Branch affair, which is a beautifully misnamed ship. And that's for another night, if you'll ever have me back. You probably won't. Chittenden won the next election handily. He was back in the governor's seat in 1790, but by then the negotiations with New York had gone forward, and the Assembly passed the enabling legislation, as you remember, paid New York $30,000 to get rid of their claims. And most of that New York money went to those large speculators that had been involved in trying to put Vermont down for years since the 1770s. The Allens were, Ethan died in '89, but his correspondence prior to that, he clearly did not want to get into the Union. Ira Allen didn't want to get into the Union. Levi Allen, another brother, wrote incredibly colorful letters, but how could you do something so stupid as this? But the pendulum had swung, and Chittenden didn't resist it, and essentially allowed it to happen. After the agreement with New York was signed, Vermont called a convention in which they ratified the Constitution of the United States, and that information was taken to Philadelphia, and Vermont was confirmed. Was Philadelphia or New York? It's right on the cusp when the government moves. I think it had moved to Philadelphia in '91. And by act of Congress, Vermont becomes the 14th state in March of 1791. The factions that I've been talking about gradually divide in the next decade into adherents of the Jefferson position, the Jefferson Republicans or Democrat Republicans, and the Federalists were the Washington, Hamilton, and John Adams. And Vermont politics then divides out that way, and it begins to be quite a bit more easily understood. But in the 14 years of between Vermont's Declaration of Independence and its becoming a state, the politics in this state was rough and tumble. It was very individuals, family, personal, and dirty. The Woodbridge affair, that's just dirty pool politics. I'm trying to put this together for publication. I'm a ways away from it. I appreciate your allowing me to be here with you and the Humanities Council allowing me to come and join you to give you a little sense of Vermont's past, to help me put together my thoughts. And thank you so much. I will, once when I was introducing a Vermonter by the name of Archibald Cox. Do you remember him? And he was a little hard of hearing. And so after he gave his talk, we had about 300 people in the auditorium. I stood up and said that Mr. Cox would be happy to take questions, and if you'll ask them to me, I'll relay them to him. And I told him a story about a judge in northern Wisconsin. This took place in Wisconsin, who, in the Midwest, judges are elected, and they're pretty heavily engaged in political life. And also, Wisconsin is not known to dislike beer. And this judge would be out at political meetings all the time, and he would come home and he would be pretty well wrapped up. And he'd come in and stagger around, and after years of this, his wife finally said, this is the end of this. You either quit drinking and quit coming home schnockered, or I'm going to make life very expensive for you and I'm going to leave. And he got the message and he went on the wagon, and it lasted about 10 days. And one night he came in, just 3 sheets to the wind, reached for the light switch and hit the rack of pots and pans, and they clattered and went over. He fell on the floor. When the light went on, there she was in her robe and curlers. And, what do you have to say for yourself this time? What do you have to say? Madam, I will take questions from the floor. Do you want to talk about this any longer, or you want to go home? Was it interesting? I appreciate hearing that. I don't know. I'm a little frightened of you tonight. Normally I'm not at all. If I bring in 60 slides of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, I'm happy. I got the slides and we can do that sort of thing. But I hope it wasn't incoherent. I hope you enjoyed it. But I'll tell you, I really enjoy being able to take part in the first Wednesday series. I think it's a terrific thing, and frankly, Allie White and the people with whom she works at the Humanities Council have really set up a nice job and good programs for you. So thank you, Mrs.